Well, hello, everybody. Thanks for having me here. It's always fun to talk about myself and the industry I'm in, so it should be enjoyable. And I'll try to go through some of the more pedantic overviewy things to compress down to 30 minutes. And in the Q&A section, if you need to sort of review some of the basics, if you will, I'm happy to go over that as well. So first of all, to sort of give you my bona fides or whatnot, I have an interesting history here that makes me kind of unique in presenting about analysts and talking about what we do. And so as you can see kind of briefly, I don't usually go this egotistical with a resume-like thing, but I thought it would be relevant to the talk here. I've worked in various, on both sides of the table, or the revolving door, if you will, as a developer for about 10 years at funky little startups and big giant places like BMC. And then through some fluke of blogging and podcasting, I ended up working at RedMonk for 6 years, which is great as an analyst. And then after that, I decided I didn't want to travel so much, and I did my tour of duty at Dell, where I live in Austin, for a couple of years, working on corporate strategy and M&A, where we heavily used all of the analysts, which was very interesting, coming from being an analyst to use all of the other analysts and think about what they put out and how to deal with them, so to speak. And back in September of last year, I decided to go do analyst work again, and as I was introduced, I'm the research director of the infrastructure software practice, which is basically application development, systems management, cloud software, other exciting stuff like that. So I always like to begin my talks with, you can show my age by making a Lost reference here, but I like to begin my talks with basically the conclusions. So, you can go have a beer, leave, whatever. And if there's anything I wanted to compress about dealing with analysts, it's sort of these 8 things, if you will. And they all essentially rotate around heavily the marketing side of analysts, because if you really don't have a lot of time to spend with analysts or a lot of resources on that, one of the most effective things, the bang for your time and buck, if you will, is to treat them as influencers, if you will. And we'll go over some of the tactics of how to do this and how analysts are motivated. But if you kind of think of yourself as old Ben there, if I remember his name, there's this great scene in one of the first season or the second season where essentially he's a prisoner and he's a total underdog, and he kind of talks his way out of being all chained up there and becomes quite the leader, if you will. And a lot of the attitude that analysts have, and when you're dealing with analysts and talking with them, is sort of being that prisoner. You're sort of just on the phone all of a sudden, and you don't really know what's going on, and there's this guy or gal asking you questions, and you're kind of like held hostage to it, and you can't just hang up the phone. Like your AR or PR person will probably kill you after that. So it's a bad idea. And so a lot of what you need to figure out are sort of coping mechanisms and understanding analysts. And eventually what you want to build up to as the quick goals are thinking about how you convince the analyst that what you're doing, as I say here, is rad, if you will, or is interesting, and there's something novel about it, something that plays on what they like talking about, what they see as good for the market, and has some coolness to it, if you will. I mean, there's not a lot of analysts who like, as I was talking with some folks earlier, covering boring things. So they want to make sure it's interesting. And once you sort of get on their radar, if you will, the next sort of easy step is to think about them as a connector or an influencer and helping you reach various constituencies. And I was talking about this with a large company analyst relations person, and it really is thinking about them as sort of a third-party evangelist, if you will, or someone who can help out with your thought leadership goals and just essentially talk with the buyers that you may have and other constituencies that we'll go over. And then one of the last important things to keep in mind, if you don't remember anything else, is that once you start dealing with analysts, it's good to spend time managing that relationship. It's not just sort of like a fire and forget sort of thing. It's good to actually have an assigned person or people and have an ongoing agenda with an analyst to just keep talking with them. Because one of the primary things that analysts will trip up on is sort of like finding a fly-by-night perception about you or a company. So they need to get the sense that there's something ongoing there. So again, I always like to just kind of go over some quick tactical conclusions you have at the end there, and we'll delve into how you get out of the chains there and start, running around with your tribe and figuring out what's happening on the island. So to start sort of from the top, and I'll try to go through this somewhat quickly, but what are the reasons to talk with an analyst? It's ostensibly obvious why you would talk with press, because you want them to write a story about you, basically, and why you would talk with customers, because you want them to buy your product. But, especially when I talk with startups, it's not always clear that they understand why they're talking with an analyst by what they're doing. So here are some reasons to talk with an analyst for vendors. There's different reasons if you're in buyers, which we can talk about in the Q&A section. So first of all, you want to talk with an analyst to drive influence. And so, as we'll get into, an analyst basically talks with these sets of people. Buyers, people who are buying technologies, sellers, such as yourself, people who are selling technologies. They talk with press frequently. I talk with press at least once a week, just sort of explaining to them what's happening. So, that's a constituency that we have. And definitely analysts talk with investors frequently, especially at 451. We have a pretty substantial investor community, and all across the M&A spectrum to larger PE funds. And we spend a fair amount of time talking with them, just as an example, we'll have a call like, hey, is IT management as a service a thing? I'm thinking of investing in there. And we'll talk for 60 minutes about it. And so the other last bit is sort of my own personal stuff is, we're all sitting here in this place, so I'm sure you find technology in the tech world somewhat entertaining. And analysts in their various forms can kind of be a form of nerd entertainment, right? So whether they're an analyst on a podcast or people like Horace Deju at a Simco, it's just sort of like something interesting to read. And not all of the classic analysts, your Gartners and Forresters of the world who have a paywall, we have a paywall as well, are necessarily good for that kind of entertainment. But there are emerging people in the analyst space, especially at my old firm Red Monk, who are entertainers, if you will. So another reason you might talk and work with an analyst, more importantly, is just research. And this is you getting educated about your market, the news that are happening, the trends, competitive analysis, especially market sizing and market share. Yes?
Just the last point. So OpsCode got its start and actually got its venture funding as a result of a single tweet that Cote sent out, which in a velocity session that Adam Jacob presented, he said, "This is a venture-backed startup waiting to happen." And that was slide 4 in our pitch deck that got us funded in 2008 when no one else could. And it is difficult to overstate the value of having somebody like him talking to investors about you. And I have always been a huge analyst skeptic, so I just wanted to say that as a
Yeah. I'd almost forgotten about that. I need to incorporate that into here. But yeah, that gets to, we can speak some more about this, but the changing nature of how analysts publish is definitely, I've been lucky to join when things like doing that in Twitter, like publishing in Twitter would seem crazy just 5 years ago. But it's definitely one of the avenues that that an analyst exudes their influence, if you will. So to that point, some of the, beyond 140 characters, for example, at 451, we'll write lots of profiles of startups, and we just wrapped up what happened in M&A last year and what we predict is going to happen this year. And, so you can imagine some of the investor community reads our stuff as just information about what's happening. And equally as vendors, you can come in and read what competitors are up to, trends that we're seeing, all sorts of things like that. So for us, we have that all behind a paywall, so it's not quite like going and perusing it freely. But there are other analysts who do things freely out there. But there's definitely a lot of stuff behind analyst paywall that's interesting. And the last item is not so much vendor-centric. Many of the other analyst shops, they actually spend a lot of time writing how-tos, if you will. So things that enterprise architects or development managers essentially would use to figure out how they should implement big systems. So as a historic thing, if you remember SOA, service-oriented architectures, that was a very analyst-driven thing. There's lots of how-tos written about that and all sorts of documentation. So the next thing you might do with an analyst, the third thing is consulting. And they might call this advisory or inquiry, but essentially you're paying to talk and get advice from an analyst. And often we can be pretty cheap. You can just buy us lunch or drinks and we'll just freely give you advice as well. But essentially what you can do with the consulting is after reading our research or looking at whatever we published, you can come in and get deeper research. So one thing that lots of analyst groups will do is they'll do some market sizing, and they'll kind of have this mysterious lack of detail about things. And of course, you could pay them to get more of that. And we used to do that back when I was on the vendor side quite a bit, is just to get, as we would say, better cuts of the market and more understanding of how they're slicing things up, which at a large company you do quite a bit of. So the other thing you might do with an analyst is really look at them to help you with your product and strategy, or your product management, or what should we do next? What constituencies should we go about? And if you think about it, an analyst is basically out there talking with all these people, and what you're looking to do is use them as a way of kind of multiplying your ability to go out and talk with people. So that's a fair amount of vendor consulting work that I've done over the years, and we do at 451. And additionally, as you get bigger, there's a fair amount of M&A consulting that we do with large companies who are, once we understand what a company's strategy is and what their portfolio holes are, we'll spend time talking with them about what they might do to fill those holes and interesting companies. And additionally, whether it's biz dev or partnering, it's a similar sort of matchmaking, if you will, whether it's sort of a marriage or just sort of a casual dating affair between companies. And then there's also a fair amount of marketing, if you will, or more specifically doing message testing and what I would call Kool-Aid testing, right? Like I do a fair amount of work that's sort of, here's something that we want to do, and we think it's awesome, but we're kind of aware that we think everything's awesome. So can you tell us if this is a thing or not? So there's a lot of bouncing off of analysts, sort of like figuring out if you're sane, essentially, and you're not drinking too much of your own Kool-Aid. And all of this, obviously, is done under strict NDA and in secret, which gives analysts that ability to do consulting, whereas with journalists and other people who might be equally well-positioned with information aren't really in a position to help you out with this. And then a final tactical thing to use analysts for, and this is especially popular in large companies, but after reading that, all sorts of stories of how startups begin, I'm sure it might be somewhat useful in startup communities, is often you have an idea that you would like to do, and everyone's like, they don't want to listen to you. So it's fun to bring in a third party to sort of be a mouthpiece for your idea. And over the many years I've been an analyst, this actually happens a lot more than you would think. So you kind of find an analyst that's aligned with you and wants the thing you do, and they kind of pitch to the meeting, and everyone's like, oh, that analyst has this great idea. And if you can kind of like be humble and not realize that like you had the idea first, you can kind of get shit done, essentially. So there's a lot of engagement in the consulting area that's kind of managing internal politics that happens as well. So just very briefly to give you a sense of the work products that analysts produce, because since a lot of the things are behind paywalls, you don't always get a chance to see these things, so I wanted to kind of go over some of the basics that we have. And thinking about the work products we produce is important for thinking about how to deal with analysts, because it helps you realize kind of what they need to deliver, right? So the last part that we'll go over is basically a fundamental analyst thing, a briefing. And so as we look through these products, kind of remember the structure of them and think about how you would tailor a 30 or 60-minute conversation with an analyst to help them produce these things and the information you would feed to them. So one of the primary things that analysts produce are reports, if you will. And way back when, I'm sure these came in 3-ring binders and they were printed out. And here's just a sampling of some of the reports from my group and from my old shop at RedMonk. And you can kind of see there's the IBM Goes Bonkers business over there, which basically is just a coverage of IBM getting into DevOps and their view of it. And what it essentially covers is I sat down and talked with several IBM people. I put in some thought about what this means and what they should be doing, and I wrote up, I think it was like 1,600 words or so. And all those constituencies that you want to influence, since we have a paywall, we track everyone who reads things, and you can see lots of people coming to read this and kind of understand what IBM's up to from a competitive or an investing or just a nerd entertainment standpoint. And then the other type of, and that's what we call a short form report, and lots of analysts do just, 1,000, 1,500 word sort of short form things here and there. And there's many analysts nowadays who don't have a paywall that they basically blog these things, which is what you see Donnie over there doing at RedMonk. If you go to RedMonk, they don't really have a paywall, and everything they write is basically a blog post, essentially, but it's better to think of it as a report that they've written. And then in the middle is sort of the staple of most analyst work. And that is basically a PDF that's maybe 20 or 30 pages, and it selects, let's call it a expansive topic, and sort of describes the market, slices it up, tell you who the vendors are in there, tell you what the buyers are doing, and probably takes a swag at sizing the market. So this is one that one of the guys on my team, Dennis Callahan, wrote this past December and November. And it basically goes over the companies like New Relic and other companies that are doing monitoring as a service or APM as a service. And it's just a lot of roundup of who the vendors are, what the trends are, and sort of our predictions for that. And again, these are like 30-page lengthy reports, so they're pretty dense, and they also get pretty pricey as well. All these things, except the free content, of course, you have to pay for. So the next thing, and 451 doesn't really do this too much, but this is a lot of why you talk to the other analyst firms, is there's a lot of rankings going on. You know, one of my old product manager friends once said that, you know, it's a lot like, I don't know if that Blackwell guy still does it, but every year he's got like the worst and best dressed people. And that's a lot of what goes on here. So here I've got a sample of the Magic Quadrant for Infrastructure as a Service from 2011, if I remember. And here we are, Dell. We were very excited about that, to be dead last. It was just great. And then we shut down cloud, and then we're not going to show up again. Or they aren't, I guess. But this Magic Quadrant, so there's a lot of time that goes into this, and generally it's worth it. So you'll be sent like, I don't know, a 30-page Excel spreadsheet of a bunch of requirements and features and things that you fill out. And then Lydia Leong, who runs this, and her team go through this. And there you go. They pop that out. And then essentially, as you can guess, you want to be in this quadrant, because that's pretty much your instant shortlist for any company that wants to buy cloud service. They can target those companies. So these kind of things, you know, as an analyst who doesn't, you know, speaking about my competitor, very important in general for your mainstream enterprise buyers. Now, another thing that you'll see, you know, here's the famous Gartner hype cycle, right? Which will basically track, you know, I forget which hype cycle this is. I think this is platform as a service. And so it's kind of tracking different elements along the maturity cycle, right? Here's my favorite, the trough of disillusionment. And you can see things climbing up here. Now, these get used more for people who are deciding when they should try a new technology or buy into a new technology, right? Like generally, if you're risk averse, you want to avoid this slope. And you probably want to like more pay attention over here. So these are a little less important than the quadrant, but they're equally interesting to look at. And there's a lot more entertainment value in those. And then down here, Forrester, another large company, has its own version of the quadrant called the wave. And you know, you still want to be in the upper right-hand corner. Generally the same idea, if you will. And across all sorts of segments, whether it's infrastructure, applications, hardware, whatever, these different artifacts will be produced for rankings. So another item that analysts produce, especially these guys IDC, but also ourselves, we have the market monitor service, is we do a lot of market sizing. So you can see, and this comes, and again, I wanted to kind of show you what these actually look like. This comes in a giant pivot table you'll get from Gartner, and it's like all software projected out to like 2017 with geographic shares, company shares, all sorts of things like that. So you can narrow down to like batch job management and all sorts of anything that you want, except things that are basically have been invented in the last 2 years. So if you look at this, it kind of lags basically back to 2012, and their adoption of newer technologies, both at IDC and Gartner, is generally pretty slow. Like Jesse probably remembers when Mary Jo Turner started tracking Chef in her automation stuff, but I think it was like 2 or 3 years ago, maybe. It was somewhat late to the game, but it's fun seeing that. And then you know we do that ourselves at 451, and it's fun to get these little bar charts. And you know, these are kind of good mostly for talking with investors and thinking about your own strategy. I'm not sure if customers get all excited about anything other than market share. You're usually more interested in something working than how much money there is that you're taking from them. So the other work products that we have, just to go quickly through it. So we do a lot of webinars. So essentially what you'll do in a webinar is, you can think of it as the first 30 minutes is you bring along an analyst to kind of validate the ideas and the industry and the area you want to talk about, and then you kind of do your pitch at the end. That's a very common webinar format, if you will. And the whole point of doing a webinar and these other things is to lead gen, essentially, right? So you want to have some people self-qualify that they're interested in this obscure topic that an analyst is going to come talk about, and you know, you get all their email addresses and contact information, and we do a lot of webinars. So webinars are still something that's used quite a bit in the, at least in the enterprise space. The other things that we do is we do a lot of speaking engagements at our own conferences and other conferences. And increasingly there's a fair amount of what I used to call new media. I need a better name for that, but doing podcasts and screencasts and videos. And you know, here's kind of a sampling of videos that I used to do quite a bit, where we would just sit down and talk with someone. And what a lot of people look at podcasts and videos as is, depending on how you manage your funnel for getting customers, you just need raw content. And you know, analysts are pretty fiddly about being unbiased and all of that, but it's pretty easy for them to generate content where they just sit down and talk with you. And all of these new media things are a good way of doing that. So, you know, there are analysts who will write a paper for you and let you edit it pretty closely, essentially. We don't really do that at 451. But, you know, a good loophole through that is to do one of these media products where you sit down with them and you get the same analyst cachet and sort of, you know, sprinkly goodness, if you will, without having them cross the line of being biased and just kind of being a complete mouthpiece for you. So, getting down to some of the tactical things, what are some quick ways you can engage with analysts? And what we'll get into here is, this is a very self-serving part of the presentation. You know, if anything could help me out more, it would be sort of like telling people what to do in a briefing and what not to do. Because, you know, analysts don't have a tremendous amount of time, and it's kind of frustrating when 60 minutes kind of gets blown because something wasn't prepared very well. So the first thing you do when you work with an analyst is definitely establish your goals, whether you're a big company or a small company. And in talking with analyst relations folks, this was like the first thing all of them said. And analyst relations people are basically like PR people, except they deal with analysts. And there's a whole like cadre where this you know, remember when that was popular to put words over this video? You know, this funny video comes from there. It's the IIR, Institute of Industry Analyst Relations or something. And there's a couple of bodies that basically train you to do AR and books and all sorts of folks you can hire to do it. But the most important thing in going with an analyst, I mean, unless you know what you're doing, is to really figure out why you're talking with them and be very clear about what your goals are, right? And as we were going over in the conclusions part at the beginning, you know, your goal could be just to inform yourself, just read the research and see what's going on, which is fine. And you can sign up with analyst houses to get behind their paywall or just talk with them and just use it for your own edification. And you know, the second one is the more popular thing, is essentially you're trying to use analysts as a influencer lever, and you're basically trying to feed them material and otherwise brainwash them to think you're awesome. And you know, that's a very orchestrated, you know, it takes a lot of work to do that. You can't just sort of give a stock presentation and hope that turns out well. And then the next thing is, beyond sort of getting them to write something nicely about you, it's definitely interesting to engage with them on word of mouth, if you will. And as we were going over at the beginning, if you think about the network of people that folks like myself spend all day, all week, all month talking with, you know, we'll just have lunch with someone and ask them, what do you think of this company? Have you heard of that? Like, what's the story with that? And there's a lot of just insider baseball, if you will, that goes on. And a lot of big vendors have the luxury of hiring full-time people to basically do this, but you essentially want to make sure the analyst is abreast of like what's going on with you, so that in their casual conversation and talking with buyers and sellers and all their constituency, that you're medium of mind, if not top of mind. And then the next, you know, another goal that you might have is that content generation, whether it's a webinar or a video or getting a paper or whatever. It might just be a pure marketing thing. And to be honest, at kind of like the medium and small company scale, that's most of what people generally try to do with analysts, is they try to get basically just outsourced marketing efforts from them, whether it's getting reprints or all those other artifacts that I was going over. And you know, for an analyst, that's sort of like the most boring, frustrating thing to work on, but it's also the easiest money to make. And it's also ethically the most dicey. I mean, as an analyst, you always have to make sure you're not selling out, if you will. But that's definitely an area an analyst will respond to. And then finally, beyond just informing yourself, depending on, I don't know, how smart you think you are versus advice other people could give you, it might be handy to get advice from analysts. So, you know, generally this is what happens after you establish a long-term relationship with an analyst, is you just sort of ongoing will pre-brief them and tell them about, you know, your roadmap, some announcements you might have coming up, and just try to get their input on it. And as we'll kind of get into, you know, it's nice to establish a rapport with an analyst where you've just talked with them for years and you kind of just have an ongoing dialogue with them to sort of help inform your company. And, you know, it's definitely a lot cheaper than giving them equity in your company just to like pay their bill every now and then. So the first step to engaging with analysts is sorting them. And essentially, the most important thing in my experience here is to think about the sort of the style of analyst, if you will. So are they analysts that are really into just writing a bunch of reports and covering the industry, or do they want to engage with you in a consultative way? Do they really want to write marketing things with you? You know, the middle two areas are important to think about as well, and that is, in the analyst world, there's a lot, I always think of them as like the older fellas, and they're all guys generally, in the blue blazers with the gold buttons. And those guys are usually like storage analysts, and they're just sort of like crotchety, and they don't understand like what was wrong with like, you know, Sun or whatever. And it's important to identify who the cynics and the optimists are, right? Because generally, if you want to do sort of like external-facing things, you want to engage with an optimist versus a cynic. A cynic might be good for making sure you don't shoot yourself in the foot or something, but it's good to identify who those folks are. And then the second just quick observation I've made is that there's a lot of analysts who used to be tech journalists who become analysts, and there's several analysts like myself who used to be practitioners, and they become analysts. And they generally have different approaches to things. And if you can identify those two demographics, if you will, cynics, optimists, or journalists, or practitioners, it kind of changes the way you approach and talk with the analysts. As you can expect with the journalists, they become experts, but it's not like they were experts at some point, and so they're just kind of always relating things back to how things used to be and what they used to do. And journalists tend to be more reporting driven, and they want facts, and they want to write things up, whereas a practitioner, like myself, will just kind of talk aimlessly for hours on end just to entertain themselves and think about the old days. And then, of course, cost is a big consideration, especially at the startup scale, right? It might be really cheap to engage with one set of analysts, and you get the kind of same bang for your buck, versus engaging with the larger shops that would be very expensive. So to that end, it's very important to think about how analysts get paid. Because, we're in this weird space where we basically get paid to talk and type, right? And that's not really valued by the world, those mediums, paying for them. So we get really persnickety if people try to get free shit from us. So it's always important, the first point, if you don't remember anything else, it's always important to be respectful of, am I trying to get free stuff from this person? Or, I should at least acknowledge that, hey, sorry about this, I know you usually get paid for it, but can I ask for this? Because you'll kind of find analysts getting cagey when you sort of cross that line of normally to open my mouth after this point, it helps me pay my mortgage, so it'd be great if you didn't make it so my house forecloses. So, and generally, the ways we get paid are paywalls, as I was saying at 451 and all the other firms we have that. And, there's sort of, I don't know all the industry rates, but, there's usually several thousands of dollars a year that you pay to get access to various slices of that. We get paid for consulting, as I was going over, showing up at conferences. And these last two items are kind of the new frontier of getting paid as an analyst, and that is analysts might put on sponsored conferences or otherwise just have sort of antics that are up to sponsored. So if you look at my old firm, Red Monk, one of the guys there, James Governor, gets basically underwritten by Pure Systems at IBM to talk about why he likes to buy his nuts that he eats at a store versus packaging them on his own. And there's a floating head of him bouncing around, and you think, what does this have to do with Pure Systems? But he somehow manages to pull it off, and it actually gets an interesting amount of attention to what would otherwise be kind of a boring topic. If it wasn't packaged correctly, which is why he likes to buy his nuts packaged, because he doesn't have to worry about packaging them. So, briefings. So again, the important thing to think about with briefings is they are extremely highly structured, generally, is what an analyst will like. And over here on this side, you can kind of see, I extracted this from our analyst guide at 451 when I started, and it's just sort of the canned template of what you would want answered as an analyst. Now, in my dreamland, I would just send this over and not actually have to talk with anyone, and then I could just write some article for that, but that seems really irresponsible. So it's sort of like a professional point of pride that I don't just send this stuff over. And more, I want to suss that out and see if it's in their presentation. But the general template that I would recommend following is to start with a company overview, so who you are, how big you are, when you started, what your funding history was, just a profile that you would kind of give anyone. And then it's good to go into the problem that you solve. Right? And, the last point that I'll get to kind of sums this up, but it's important not to over-rotate on hype and vision and things like that. Analysts tend to be very pragmatic and knowing and wanting to hear what you do. I mean, they want to hear that you have a hammer, not a, domestic housing construction device or whatever. And they want to know that the hammer is used to pound in a nail. And then maybe you have an air hammer, and that pounds in nails faster. Just very basic stuff. So it's always good to identify the problem you're solving, how you solve it, and that's where you can, if you've looked up the background of the analyst and figure out how technical they are, it's always good to get pretty technical on the how you're solving the problem and sort of kind of play the game of backing off when you go too deep in something, but give an analyst a sense of how you're actually solving the problem uniquely. Because as you can imagine, every week we hear about, the next best thing after sliced bread, and we've heard all sorts of things, everything's always great. And what becomes important is having proof of how it actually works and why it's great. And after that, Also, as an analyst, we're not only interested in the technology and the product, but what your go-to-market is and the business side of things. So it's important to go over not only the market you're targeting, is it consumer, is it small and medium businesses, large enterprises, is it Asia, is it North America? Like, how are you taking the product and getting money from a customer to give them that product or service? And then underneath that, what wraps all that up is basically what I would call the business mechanics. So do you have a direct sales force, or do you sell through partners? And do you have a channel, or do you work through an app store? And are you a hosted service, or do you work behind the firewall as well? Like all of these things that have to do with, how you basically package things up and how you go to market. Analysts are very interested in that, because part of what we're judging as an analyst is not only if you've got an innovative new technology, but if you're going to survive, and if you have the business smarts to last long enough by running your business well. And then it's always good, and I kind of have these in priority more or less. It's always good to go over a roadmap and sort of like what you're planning to do next. And at that point, you can kind of tell an analyst it's under NDA and make them feel all special and tell them some secrets. And you can kind of tell them what you're thinking about. And then you want to, it's nice to go over the strategy. And what I mean by strategy here is what are the general principles that we're going to follow to make money? And what are the things we're not going to do? So, a strategy might be, we're not going to do a licensed software. We're only going to deliver it as a service. I mean, that's a very high-level strategy. Or we're only going to sell through partners who are working with Fortune 50 companies. But it's always nice to kind of show that you've thought through the mechanics of what your strategy is. And then the last thing, which is, I don't know, maybe this is my own personal thing, but frankly, like, vision's not really so important. Like, we get so much vision all the time that, we probably are familiar with it, right? Like, it's, you're always going to save the world with your technology. So as far as tactics, so the first thing to remember is analysts generally think in terms of 30 and 60 minutes. So some analysts will have a 30-minute briefing, others will have 60, so it's good to form it around there. And you want to allow like 10 minutes for questions or so, and also allow a fair buffer for analysts to ask questions throughout. Another good tactical thing to think about is that somewhat, I mean, you can always try to go off the record, although as they say in your press training, there is no off the record with press people. But with analysts, you actually can go under NDA, if you will, because we would completely be out of business if we couldn't keep secrets. So essentially, whether you need a signed NDA, which is always an annoyance, or you can just kind of trust someone, all you really have to do is tell us something's NDA, and we won't really talk about it. Like, that's pretty much the rules of the game there. So it's good as you're going through your briefing to tag and say what's NDA and what's not, because generally we'll assume everything's public unless you tell us otherwise. And then also, just in the tactics of your presentation, all throughout the 2000s, we got all tufty crazy and we just had like fancy pictures on slides without any text, which analysts don't really like. Like, I don't really need to see an image of some guy standing in front of a data center yet again, right? Like, instead I want to see some dense text and lots of content, if you will. In fact, it would be novel. It'd be interesting if someone just sent a paper instead of a briefing. But generally, the more content you can jam into the presentation, the better, because the analyst will also use that presentation instead of taking copious notes. So it's good to have bullets instead of clip art. And just standard meeting things that you would assume. It's always better to have a PDF than a WebEx. It's always good to have a demo if there's something easily demoable that makes it real, especially when there's a new technology. It's good to see how it actually works and the UI and what it looks like. And then finally, there's some sort of cultural things, if you will. So generally, it's good not to try to fight with an analyst. Just not so much because like we're awesome and you shouldn't fight with us, but you'll just waste all your time. And as a historic example, which I think it's old enough that I can use it, but many years ago when 3Terra was an independent company, when I was at RedMonk, we had an independent briefing with them, and we spent 40 minutes, this is before cloud was a thing, we spent 40 minutes trying to figure out exactly what it was, because they kept telling us it wasn't an operating system or a platform, and they had all this new vision of stuff. So finally we just said, so if I'm running SAP on it and I call support and they ask what version of Linux it is, what version of Linux is it running? And it just kind of blew the whole briefing essentially. And so it's good to just sort of submit like our buddy at the beginning, and not really fight with the analyst so much, because again, like, it's just going to side rail you. And also catering to us, we generally don't like to feel dumb and exposed. Like, we like to think that we know what we're talking about and we're experts. So it's good to like not draw out an analyst and show how they're silly. Now, hopefully, I like to think that I don't succumb to this, but like, many analysts will hopefully tell you like, oh, I don't know anything about this, please educate me. And they're totally open to being filled like an empty container. But sometimes you need to play up the fact that like they're an expert and they know what's going on and you're just sort of informing them of some new development. And then finally, to be a little like Dale Carnegie or whatever, it's always good to like ask for something with an analyst, and it's also good to carefully allude to future work or money that you might give them, right? So, this can get annoying after a while. Like there's lots of people that I deal with who are like, yeah, you're always saying you're going to do something, and then I talk to you 2 years later. But it's always good to sort of throw out that thread of like we might be talking more and we might be doing something, and to also ask if there's some additional data they might send you or something like that. Because essentially the business model of an analyst is, if you think about it, briefings are basically the front office, if you will, the wide end of the funnel, and all the customers generally, not all of them, but a lot of them flow through briefings. So we kind of view that as a first engagement with the customer. So it's always good to like feel like we're moving down the funnel. And at the end of a briefing, if you have an analyst thinking nicely about you and that you might like help bring in some money and things like that, then you'll probably will get an extra special good write-up, if you will, versus just sort of like being a forgetful company that we talked about 3 weeks ago. So narrowing down to startups, generally it's guys like this, like my friend Charles, who are just like in some cinder block office with a bunch of fancy Macs. And when you're talking with an analyst, I would say in general your goal is to seem bigger than you are. Because most analysts mostly deal with large companies, and they think in terms of billions of dollars and gigantic swaths of the market. So it's good to try to play up how big you are and how much of sort of like a disruptor you might be, or kind of what pattern you're following. Like even if you're a company of 5 people or 2 people or however many you are, an analyst, again, wants to know that you have longevity, right? They don't want to just write about some company that disappears in 6 months or a year. So it's good to basically puff yourself up and do things like go over what your funding history is and what connections you might have, and name drop a lot and talk about what your pedigree is as far as other companies you've worked with. And it's also, the third point may seem kind of shallow, but there's a fair amount of, let's call them long in the tooth startups who kind of haven't spent time updating their presentations. And they might be like 4 or 5 years old, and you kind of see the old clip art, the sort of like armless, like little people guys with the gradient background. I'm sure you've seen these guys. But it's good to keep if you're a startup especially, to keep your presentation updated and in whatever the style of the time is. Because again, we'll be judging you on little things like that, on how fresh you're keeping things versus like you're basically just repackaging old wine in old bottles. It's better at least to have, it's good to have new wine, but it's also good to have new bottles. And then the last things, again, for a startup, the big thing that we're interested in is like, so how are you going to get money, either by being bought by someone or driving revenue? And so it's good to acknowledge I was just talking with someone earlier who didn't necessarily have all of the revenue and the ways of doing money figured out, but you want to acknowledge that yes, we're working on that, and our goal is to make money, not be like a sock puppet on TV or whatever. So you definitely want to directly address how the money's coming in and how you're thinking about that, and show that you're intelligent about driving revenue. Because again, we're not only interested in the technology, but we're interested in the business side of things. So, above all else, this is just a personal pet peeve I have, is like, I call this the computers are awesome anti-pattern. And that's basically like, oh, this cloud thing, it's going to let you deliver software faster and cheaper, which is like, well, that's computers, right? Like computers have always done that. And so like if you take a step away from whatever you're pitching and you think about it, and if you kind of start going down like a spiral of benefits-y talk, right? Like you should talk about the benefits and not just the technology. Like it's pretty easy to fall into the computers are awesome trap. And whatever you're doing better make me more agile, it better be cheaper, and it better as a customer help me make more money. And so that's not even table stakes, that's just what computers do. So when you're forming your deck, like don't really pitch that kind of thing. Like the kind of thing you would pitch to a general audience at a keynote, talk about why your thing is different and why it's going to be better, not just that it's awesome. Oh, it looks like I need to check into my hotel. My mouse doesn't work to fix that. So, you can see where I'm located. You can catch up with me tonight. So, the other thing to do, like I was saying, you throw out some life rafts to people, and you want to establish some ongoing engagement. And I kind of went over this already verbally, but it's good to just sort of like have an informal communication with an analyst you've built a relationship with, an email. Like, I have some folks, one guy in particular, for example, from Dell, who just emails me stuff, and I email stuff back to him. So we're kind of always on each other's radar, if you will. And to that end, it's good to have a consistent set of contacts, right? So, one of the troubling signs as an analyst is to see shifting people who are responsible for talking with analysts. Like, it's good to always have the same person or people talking with the analyst. And then also consulting can be a way to always to further engage with analysts and stay on their radar. And it's also nice to have basically pre-briefings for things that you have coming up. And what you'll hear from analysts as you talk with them more is, the earlier you talk with me, the more I can help you, right? And so if you tell them that you have some announcement coming out tomorrow or whatever, they can't really help you with anything. So they're just kind of there taking notes. So it's good to talk with them sometime ahead of time, and if you want to have an ongoing relationship, give them the chance to help you out, essentially. And then, of course, like I was saying, I'm sure there's plenty of analysts who go to like AA meetings and things like that. But in general, we spend a lot of time in the bar. I mean, that's where a lot of research happens, as it were. So, and what I like to tell my friends, especially at big companies, is now that I'm an analyst again, when you go out to lunch with me, you can always expense it. So keep that in mind. So with that, thanks. And I went a little over 30 minutes, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have at sort of layers of depth, and we can go on the record or off the record, but that's it. So at 451, and the other shops do this as well, we generally, it's like any other paywall. Like, we publish the headlines and like a brief summary of what the articles are. So you can go to my 451 biography page and see everything I've written in the past 4 months and get a sense of the companies that I cover and things like that. And because we're selling access to the paywall, there's also sort of packages of like, this practice covers that, and so forth and so on. And then also generally, on our site, you can sign up for a 30-day trial. But if you can, put up with salespeople at the various firms, they'll generally give you at least 30 days free to poke around at it. And then also, you can also always just Google for things. There's a surprising amount of stuff just available out there. And then as Jesse was saying, there's some of us who spend a lot of time in Twitter and other places. Like, I used to be a big Delicious user, and now I use Pinboard, right? And in theory, you could go look at all the tags there and figure out what I'm interested in. Yeah, I mean, I think it's important, but maybe not as important as you might think. Like, it's good to have the founder in there because it generally shows like a level of importance, and to put it another way, if the founder is interesting, it's good to talk with them. If the founder is more of an operational person and they're more interested in just like making numbers and doing things, then that may not be such a great thing to talk about. And as startups become later stage, they'll bring the adult supervision in as the CEO, and it's often nicer to talk with sort of like the product person, if you will. So and then on that point, as far as selecting who to talk with, the other thing that tactically you can use to your advantage is, it's always good to talk with the person who has the budget. So whether that's the VP of marketing, and we would always assume the CEO has budget control, but that's not always the case. So it's generally a good move to have someone who is responsible for analyst spending talk to the analyst, because it of course interests them greatly. Well, I would not tell them. I mean, it's sort of dicey, right? Let's say there's two modes. If you're trying to go deep with an analyst, it's generally pretty good to tell them everything that you think would help you out personally and as a company. And I'll give you an example. So a lot of people I've established long-term relationships with, I mean, they'll tell me when they're looking for a new job and try, have me help them, hustle them around to people and give them advice and things like that, which you would think would be, if you're VP of whatnot and you're like looking for a new job, you're probably going to, as an analyst, you're like, well, I guess that's not working out so well at that company. But, companies come and go, but people live much longer. And so as an individual, you can tactically, the more open you are, is generally okay. I mean, you have to establish a good relationship. But I would generally say what you don't want to tell an analyst is too much about the insolvency of a company, right? So if you're desperate to raise more money, or like you're firing people, or like if you're kind of running out of money, you want to try to hold off on that as long as possible, unless you think there's some sort of advice that you can get, right? So again, you might tactically think like, well, if this analyst likes us and we win them over and we'll have them call up this guy we want some money from and things like that, like you can tactically use them for that kind of thing. But, generally, so the other thing is, I would say maybe like the roadmap beyond 6 or 12 months, unless you really trust the analyst, it's good not to talk to them about that because it'll probably change. And it's not necessarily good to have an analyst think that you're, what was that old phrase, that you flip-flop around a lot, or that you're indecisive, right? So, there's always, in fact, there's a personality type that I come across, thankfully not frequently, but it's the CEO who changes the website at 3 a.m. every week, right? And, who just kind of dramatically switches things around and they change a lot. And that kind of instability in the executive ranks is not really cool with analysts. So you want to try to, whatever you do, kind of try to say that, have the analyst think that it's stable and things are going well, and not that it's like crazy. Like, for example, I read that Hatching Twitter book. That would have been terrible to tell an analyst if analysts covered Twitter. I mean, that's like madness. So you want them to get the idea that things are not so chaotic.
Would you try and become like buddies with a single person? And like a separate kind of meta question, is there a blog that deals, or some sort of source of material that deals with dealing with analysts?
Yeah. So I mean, especially if you're a smaller or even medium-sized company, it's good to pick like 2 or 3 analysts that you spend most of your time with. And depending on like what your major release schedule is, it's good to set aside time to talk to all the analysts, in quotes, whoever that might be. But I would generally spend your money and your time on a select group of analysts as a small company, because you're just not going to be, it's better to go deep with an analyst than shallow with a bunch of them. And so yes, there's that Institute of Analyst Relations I was going over, and there was like a burgeoning world of talking about analysts 4 or 5 years ago, but I don't really come across a tremendous amount of it. I mean, there's not really like the AR website that covers it in depth. No. Well, I mean, there is a guy, oddly enough, in Austin, and it's called like the Capital Group or something like that. And I think he has a book. And there's there's 2 people that I know of. There's another guy, Duncan. I forget his last name, embarrassingly. He'll probably give me bad marks now. But he's over in London, and then there's the guy in Austin at Capital something. And they basically come in and train analyst relations groups at large companies. And I mean, the issue with them is like they get paid to talk, so they don't necessarily write a lot. But that Duncan guy actually publishes a fair amount of rankings and things like that. So I would say probably quarterly is as fine-grained as you want to get, unless, again, all these things like, Orwell's 11th rule of writing, unless you don't want to, like there's some good reason to do it. For example, I generally will talk with Opscode or Chef or Puppet or these guys I've known forever whenever they call me, just because I'm interested in them. But yeah, I mean, more than a quarter is just like, is there really that much going on that we're going to update on? But I mean, I would also say anytime there's a significant event that you would write a press release about, you should at least inform an analyst about it and offer to talk with them. So as a startup, when you get funding, maybe if you hire like one of your top 3 executive positions, if you have a gigantic customer win, like another great thing that analysts are always looking for from startups is the momentum press release, right? Like whether you hide behind percentages or give actual numbers, right? Like knowing what growth is always very important. But yeah, I would say at least don't let a year go by, and then a quarter is probably the smallest amount. Thank you.